Cut off the telephone, stop all the clocks, silence Alexa and turn on the box. No footsteps down hall and no creak of the floor. Stop dishwasher's cycle, it rumbles no more. Turn off the oven and let tea go cold. Unplug the doorbell lest ring chime be tolled. Lock all the doors up and pull curtains tight. Settle on sofa, tonight's Corrie night. It's Monday and Wednesday and Friday's best part. The thrill in my veins, the beat of my heart. My evening and morning, my thoughts and my chatters. 'Cause when Corrie's on, nowt else in the world matters. Turn every light off and put out the cat. Hush every voice, put an end to all chat. For when cobbles call, every sound must be stilled. For only in Corrie my heart is fulfilled. Once upon a cobbled evening, tired, sighing, screen a-gleaming, thinking of the latest Corrie sitting there with brew and crumb. As I sat there nearly napping, suddenly there came a rapping. 'Twas the sound of some brisk tapping, tapping like a steady drum. Happened just a bird, I muttered, settling in from where it's come, tapping with a gentle thrum. But the flapping grew much louder, like the bird was getting prouder, till I knew this brazen fowl had ample gumption and then some. Curious, I raised the curtain, though I wasn't wholly certain what this bird so bold was blurting, parked on sill on feathered bum. A silver pigeon perched there surely, nodding head to theme tunes hum. Quoth the pigeon, "E by gum." "Pigeon," said I, "bird so striking, northern nestling, Corrie liking, from the cobble's gritty pathways to my window here you've come. Tell me, bird, of tales you bring, secrets Corrie folk may sing, of affairs or tempers flared, all brewing strong like Newton's rum." But the bird just blinked and squawked out words so common and humdrum, the same steady "E by gum." I pleaded then, quite desperately, "Give me gossip, preferably, of the street's unravelling dramas, of the woes or joys to come. Tell me if our Carla's troubled, or if Gemma's debts are doubled. Are there secrets left unbubbled, or some secret depths to plumb?" But the pigeon only blinked and squawked out words both plain and glum. Quoth the pigeon, "E by gum." By the hour I questioned plainly, what's in store for Sally mainly? Will we love her tales insanely, or will they leave viewers numb? What of Jenny, pub on corner of the street? Will someone warn her? Warn her that her lodger Kit has got no honour, he's just scum. And the pigeon held its silence, sitting there and keeping mum. Quoth he merely, "E by gum."
It was a grey, drizzling afternoon when I first arrived in Weatherfield, a small industrial town on the outskirts of Manchester. I'd heard much about the place over the years, particularly its history, a close-knit community, known for its cobbled streets, local pub, and a certain atmosphere that was hard to describe. As someone with a keen interest in local history, I had come to Weatherfield to explore my own roots, for there were whispers that some distant branch of my family tree sprouted from this very place, a Grimshaw, a Tanner, even a Barlow somewhere amongst them. The cabby had warned me in a low voice as we approached the town. "Be careful, love. Weatherfield's not like other places. People round here, they've got strange ways." I dismissed him with a laugh, thinking it was just the usual northern banter, but as we turned the corner and I first set my eyes on the famous cobbles of Coronation Street, a chill crept up my spine. I checked into the B&B at the pub, where I was met by a beautiful young brunette with a scar and a sneer. When she smiled, it was brittle and dismissive. As she helped me to my room, she muttered something under her breath about keeping inside after dark, which I took to be the typical concerns of one woman to another. The first few days were uneventful, with my time spent at the local cafe, Roy's Rolls. The proprietor, Roy Cropper, seemed friendly enough, though his conversations often veered towards the strange history of the town, stories of families who'd lived there for generations and things seen in the shadows after sundown. "You'll notice some of the folks round here don't quite act, well, normal," Roy mentioned one morning as I sipped my tea. "Been that way for years. Changes in them, slow at first, hard to see unless you know what to look for. A blonde woman in the corner sucked air into her lungs, rasping as she did so as if choking on some whiff of smoke. She looked up at me and said, "That doesn't begin to cover it. The people here, they have secrets. They whisper to each other. They have a loyalty that is deeper than blood." She looked shocked at herself and shook her head as if to rouse herself from a trance. "The ash to the skin, it gathers and smothers somehow. Secrets and lies." At first I didn't understand what the woman meant, but over the following days I started noticing it too. She was right, but then she was a detective after all, and the more I saw her, the more it seemed as though she was changing too, becoming ashen and pale and covert in her actions. There was something off about the people of Weatherfield, something in their faces. Some had dark, sunken eyes that rarely blinked. Others walked with a strange, shuffling gait, their skin glistening with a sheen that looked almost like coal dust. When I passed them in the street, I couldn't shake the feeling they were watching me, whispering amongst themselves. The locals, particularly those that had been around the longest, grew more unsettling the longer I stayed. Jenny, the landlady at the Rovers, would wipe down the bar, gathering soot on her tea towel and staring unblinking at me when she thought I wasn't looking. A tall, grimacing man in the bistro seemed to speak in half-truths, muttering under his breath when I tried to ask him questions about the town's history. They all seemed tied to something dark, something secret that the entire community was in on. It was during my second week that I noticed the strangest thing of all, changes in the weather. The constant drizzle had transformed into thick, clinging smog that rolled in from nowhere, shrouding the street in a suffocating mist. On some nights I heard odd noises from outside my window, low guttural croaks like the sound of creatures dragging themselves across the cobbles, cavorting in the ginnel and screeching against brick walls. One evening I decided to follow the source of the sounds. The streets were deserted, and as I ventured deeper into Weatherfield, past the houses and shops, the smog grew thicker. I passed by the factory where I noticed figures lurking in the shadows. Their silhouettes were strange, distorted, and wrong. They seemed hunched, with elongated limbs, moving in ways no human should. I felt drawn to walk further and stumbled into an abandoned brewery that towered over the street, a place I had heard whispers about from Roy and the others. It was there that I saw them. Townspeople gathered by a hole in the ground, a cavernous, smoking pit that looked like an old mine shaft. Their bodies were wreathed in smoke and dust. They were chanting something, a low, croaking sound that sent shivers down my spine. The fog parted for just a moment and I saw their faces, spectral, twisted, soot-stained, their blank eyes reflecting the moonlight. Suddenly, I understood. These folks weren't entirely human. Over generations, something had happened in Weatherfield, something unspeakable. The depths beneath didn't just lead to long abandoned mine shafts. There was a gateway, a link to something much older and darker than I had ever imagined. Some strange force that leaked out and ran amok in the streets, causing misery and misfortune, some compulsion that would entrance a person to their doom. I tried to flee, but as I turned to run, I stumbled into one of them, a red-headed man I had recognised from the street. He grinned at me, his lips pulling back to reveal rows of sharp, glistening teeth. "You've seen too much," he hissed. "You're one of us now." A woman with a blonde bob and a smirk tried to grab my arm as I backed away. "You're one of us," she said again. "You won't even realise what you're doing until it's too late. One wrong decision after another, one mistake and then another. All your life will be wrong turns and we'll be here to watch." I don't know how I escaped that night, but I fled back to the pub and I packed my things in a hurry. The next morning I was on the first tram out of Weatherfield. As it pulled away, I looked back at the town one last time. The fog had lifted and everything seemed normal once again, but I knew the truth. Weatherfield was no ordinary place. Beneath its charming cobbled streets, something ancient and terrible stirred, a dark secret the townspeople had embraced long ago. And though I had left, I knew I'd never truly escape its shadow, because the blood that ran through my veins was theirs.
The wind was a chill of gossip across the cobbled street. The rovers gleamed in moonlight where secrets often meet. Jack Duckworth strolled with a swagger, his suit pressed smart and fine, and in he came a strutting. The cellarman came strutting, the dirty rotten swine. The Rovers was dim with whispers as Jack came through the door, his suit so sharp, his hair slicked back like never seen before. His name was Vincent Clare that night, a man with charm to spare. And in he came a boasting. Jack Duckworth came a boasting, his look, devil may care. He scanned the room for Carol Munro, the woman dressed in red, the woman he was hoping he would wine and dine and bed. But as she turned, his heart near stopped, that face he knew too well, for Vera stood there smirking, his wife Vera stood smirking, and then she gave him hell. "Jack Duckworth!" Vera hollered loud, her wiggle set askew. "You thought you'd get one over me, but the tricked one here is you." She chased him from the Rovers, her temper flared and bright, and Vincent Clare went running. Poor Randy Jack went running back to his home that night. The years rolled by, their bickers too, but love was always there, until one night in January, V breathed her final air. Poor Jack was left alone then, heart heavy with her loss. But Vera, she was waiting. Her ghost still was there waiting from where he sat across. Years passed, and when Jack's time came, the dusk of final day, he closed his eyes in that same chair where Vera passed away. But as the light grew dim for him, he felt her by his side, for Vera came a-calling. Her spirit came a-calling. "Come on, Jack, one last ride." And off they went, their arm in arm, to where the cobbles end, with no more rows or bickering, just love to finally mend. And in the Rovers in the sky they sit as one above, for Vera had come smiling, and the cellarman's heart too was smiling, for his swamp duck, his true love.
It was a chilly morning on Coronation Street, with a thin mist clinging to the cobbles. The air smelled of brewing tea from Roy's rolls and the faint scent of petrol from Kevin's garage. But today was different. There was a buzz in the air, an undercurrent of tension that no one dared speak aloud. Today was raffle day. The annual Coronation Street raffle had been a tradition for as long as anyone could remember. A community event, it brought all the residents together, from the Platts to the Barlows, the Websters to the Allahans. Everyone participated, no exceptions. The rules were simple. Each household contributed a ticket, and at the end of the day, one name would be drawn from the jar. That name would face their fate. No one really questioned the raffle anymore. It was tradition. There were whispers, of course, late at night when people gathered over a pint at the Rovers or exchanged hurried words in the quiet corners of Roy's cafe, but no one openly challenged it. Every year, someone would win the raffle and everyone else would breathe a sigh of relief. The morning sun began to rise higher, casting long shadows over the street, and soon the residents started to gather in front of the community centre. Dee Dee was there, adjusting her scarf against the cold. Audrey and Gail stood together, talking in low voices, while David hovered nearby, his face set in its usual cynical frown. Eileen arrived with Todd and Billy, their eyes scanning the crowd as if looking for some unspoken reassurance. At the centre of it all stood Ken Barlow. As the oldest and most respected resident, Ken had the honour and the burden of running the raffle each year. He held the jar in his hands, filled with small folded slips of paper, each with the name carefully written on it. His face was calm, but his hands trembled slightly. He knew, just as everyone else did, that tradition carried weight, an unbearable, suffocating weight. "All right, everyone," Ken called out, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "It's time!" The crowd hushed. People shifted nervously on their feet. The jar glistened in the weak sunlight as Ken held it high for all to see. "One by one," Ken continued, "you'll all come up and add your tickets, then we'll draw." One by one they approached. Tyrone dropped in his ticket, his face grim. Dev did the same, followed by Sally and Tim, their hands intertwined as if bracing for what might come. The jar filled slowly, each name a tiny slip of fate waiting to be plucked. Finally, the last ticket was placed in the jar. Ken swirled the slips around, the sound of the paper rustling eerily loud in the silence. He reached in slowly, his fingers brushing against the folded corners before grasping one and pulling it out. He unfolded the paper. The crowd seemed to lean in, collectively holding its breath. For a moment, everything was still. And then Ken read the name. Mary Taylor. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Mary had been standing near the back, gasped, her face turning pale. She staggered slightly, as though the very ground beneath her feet had shifted. No, she whispered, shaking her head, her usual chatter silenced in an instant. Not me. But rules were the rules. Tradition was tradition. Ken lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. The crowd parted as Roy stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He had been one of Mary's closest friends, her constant companion, but now even he couldn't save her. You know the rules, Mary, Ken said softly, his voice steady but cold. It's just your turn. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she knew better than to protest. They had all seen it happen before. Someone had to win the raffle. Someone always did. As the sun set later that evening, Coronation Street was quieter than usual. The mist had returned, thick and oppressive, clinging to the windows of the Rovers, the cafe, the corner shop. The street was still, except for one house, where the blinds were drawn and the lights had been dimmed. And somewhere, in the darkness, Mary's fate was sealed. No one would speak of the raffle again until next year, when the jar would be brought out, the names written down, and the cycle would begin anew. Tradition held Coronation Street in its grasp, and no one, no matter how much they feared it, could break free.
"'Twas brillig, and an exum beast did clag and clough through Weatherfield, where Gemma's skint and Roy's away in clink, unjustly sealed. Beware the Corrie, me duck, with lip and lash and leer. It sneaks by pub and builder's yard and leaves nought but a tear. It bullies Liam through the gates and snares Leanne in cult. With cockroach clog kebab it waits to launch vicious assault. It hides in Ginnell, feasts in bistro, checks in at Chariot Square. It lurks outside St Mary's Church and preys on local prayer. With wary heart young Chesney stood, his jaw set firm and taut. For many a time on cobbled street the Corrie he'd sought. And with a yelp it did appear, all shadows sneer and scorn. It bore the weight of each long year the street's worn souls had borne. Ches raised his chipfork fierce and brave and shouted, "Do one, mate!" And as it scriked back to its cave, Ches cried, that were great!" That night 'twas snug in Rover's light as laughter filled the pub. For once no tears, just laughs and beers and Jenny's homemade grub. Beware the Corrie, me lass, one day it shall return, for 'twixt the streets of Weatherfield the flames of doom still burn.
I had spent many nights at the Rover's return, but this one was different. That night it happened, the thing that would drive me to madness. But first, you must understand, I was not mad then, no. I was perfectly sane, calm, collected. And it was that very calmness, that precision, which led me to the deed. I had no ill feelings towards Steve MacDonald, none at all. He and his mum were the owners of the Rovers. He was a simple man, if not a bit daft, and he'd always treated me well enough. But it was the pint he served me every night, that gnawed at my soul like the ticking of a hidden clock. You see, every time I went to the Rovers, Steve poured my pint just slightly wrong. At first I thought it was my imagination, the head of the beer too large, sometimes spilling over the glass, sometimes too flat. It was an affront to a well-pulled pint, and soon I became fixated on it. How could someone who had spent so much time behind the bar not perfect this simple art? It was intentional, I reasoned. He knew it bothered me, and he took pleasure in it. For weeks I watched him. I watched the way his hands fumbled with the tap. The way he would grin, that grin, as he handed me the pint. It wasn't the beer, I knew that. It was Steve. His carelessness, his disregard for the sacred ritual of a good pint. He thought I wouldn't notice. I noticed. Every night I grew more obsessed. My mind spun with thoughts of revenge, but I knew I had to be careful. The people of Weatherfield would never suspect me. Mild, polite, always tipping well. No, I was too clever for them. I planned everything perfectly. One fateful night, when the fog pressed in thick outside the Rovers, I made my move. Steve was behind the bar, whistling that god-awful tune, and I knew tonight was the night. I waited until the regulars, Rita, Emily and Norris, had stumbled out into the night, and only I remained. The clock struck midnight. The pub was silent, save for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. "Another pint?" Steve asked, his usual grin flashing. I nodded. He turned his back to pour it, and I followed him silently behind the bar. The froth bubbled up. Too high again, it always did. That was when I knew. He deserved it. As his hand reached for the glass, I grabbed the nearest bar towel and threw it around his neck. He gasped, he struggled, but I was stronger than I looked. Oh, he fought, but soon the struggling stopped. I dragged his limp body into the cellar, the cold darkness swallowing him whole. I was free. No more ruined pints. No more of that infuriating grin. For days, no one suspected a thing. When people asked where Steve was, I shrugged. Probably gone on one of his ridiculous holidays. And I continued to go to the Rovers, ordering my pint, satisfied at last. I had done it. But oh, how wrong I was. One night, not long after the deed, I sat in my usual corner sipping my beer. It was perfect. Perfectly poured, perfectly cold. And yet something wasn't right. It started as a faint whisper in my mind, a nagging feeling. I tried to push it aside, but it grew louder. Then I heard it. A faint clink, like the sound of a glass being tapped on the bar. It was coming from the cellar. I froze. My heart raced, but I told myself it was nothing. It's just your imagination. Clink, clink. The sound wouldn't stop. Louder and louder it grew until it filled the pub, echoing in my ears. I couldn't bear it. I leapt to my seat, knocking the pint from the table. Clink, clink, clink. It was as if Steve was there, under the floorboards, tapping his pint glass, reminding me of what I'd done. I stumbled towards the cellar door. The sound was deafening now. I could hear the faint hum of Steve's voice, that terrible whistle, his mocking grin coming back to life in my mind. "Steve!" I cried. "I didn't mean to. It was just the pint. It was always the pint." I flung open the cellar door, and the tapping stopped. The darkness stared back at me, cold and silent. There was nothing there. No glass, no Steve, and yet I could still hear it in my mind, the relentless clink, clink, clink. I fled the pub, but the sounds followed me home. Every night it haunts me. No matter where I go, I hear it. Steve's pint glass, tap, tapping, tap, until I feel I might go mad. But I'm not mad. No, you must believe me. I was driven to it. It was Steve. It was the pint. And now I must live with this sound forever. Clink, clink, clink.
This is the gossip that hums in the factory. Rumours and secrets are cruel and detractory. Whispers and scandals are passed in a blur, shared with a nod and a smirk and a purr. Past spools on fabric, past needles and thread. Words spun like silk, sordid tales quickly spread. "Did you hear," cackles Beth with a glint in her eye, "about Max's new girl, about Gail's new guy? Sally's got wind of an office affair, but who's in the thick of it, Sally won't share." Machines keep a clacking, but hands start to slow as tales of street residents soon start to flow. Gossip from Izzy, gossip from Fizz, even gossip from Kirk, gossip from Dirk, gossip from Carla and Sarah Lou Barla, and gossip from Sean and from Lisa Swain Spawn. Tales of Ken, tales of Jenny and tales of Kev, tales of Dev, tales of Roy, tales of Toya and tales of Nina and tales of Alina. Stories like knicker threads woven in tight, till clock-off time comes, then they fade into night. And tomorrow the factory will open again. The workers arrive, machines start to clatter. Whose name shall be next on those seamstresses' tongues? Whose lives will be unpicked like poorly stitched thread? And which poor souls will suffer the ultimate fate in Weatherfield, the curse of being forgotten?